My parents skipped my emergency surgery because they didn't want to miss my younger brother's wedding. While I was lying in a hospital bed waiting to be taken into the operating room, I kept checking my phone, hoping they would walk through the doors. They never came. 5 years later, those same parents stood outside my house with my brother, begging me to make a decision that only I could make. My name is Nathan Anderson, and I'm 31 years old. Growing up, my younger brother Kevin always came first. If we both won something, my parents celebrated him louder. If we both made mistakes, mine somehow became worse. I spent years convincing myself I was imagining it because accepting the truth meant admitting I would never be my parents' first choice. Despite everything, Kevin and I weren't enemies as children. We played basketball together, shared a bedroom for years, and even defended each other at school. Things only changed after high school when my parents started calling him the future of this family. From that moment on, every important decision somehow revolved around making Kevin's life easier. I moved 3 hours away after college and built my own career as a structural engineer. The distance helped me avoid constant arguments, but it didn't repair my relationship with my parents. We spoke on birthdays and holidays, yet every conversation eventually became about Kevin's latest promotion, new house, or upcoming wedding. My own achievements barely lasted a minute. One rainy evening, everything changed. A truck ignored a red light and slammed into the driver's side of my car. When I woke up in the emergency room, doctors explained I had severe internal injuries and a fractured pelvis. They needed to operate immediately because delaying surgery could permanently affect my ability to walk without pain. The first people I called were my parents. My mother answered almost immediately, sounding excited because she was decorating the venue for Kevin's wedding the next morning. I explained what had happened and asked if they could come to the hospital. She became quiet before saying she needed to speak with my father first. Then she hung up. About 20 minutes later, my father finally called back. I expected him to say they were already driving toward the hospital. Instead, he apologized and explained they couldn't leave because hundreds of guests were arriving for Kevin's wedding. He promised they would visit me as soon as the ceremony ended and asked me to be strong for one more day. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I reminded him that doctors planned to begin surgery within the hour. There was a long silence before he quietly repeated that Kevin's wedding couldn't simply be postponed. Then he added something I will never forget. Your brother only gets married once. The hospital has doctors looking after you already. After the call ended, I stared at the ceiling without saying a word. The nurse standing beside my bed had overheard enough to understand what happened. She gently squeezed my shoulder and said, "Family isn't always the people who share your last name." At that moment, those words hurt almost as much as my injuries. The surgeon entered my room a few minutes later and introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She calmly explained every step of the operation and answered questions I was barely able to process. Before signing the consent forms, I looked at my phone one last time. There were no missed calls from my parents. The only new message came from Kevin wishing me good luck before his rehearsal dinner. The surgery lasted almost 7 hours. When I finally woke up, the first face I recognized wasn't my mother's or my father's. It was Lucas Bennett, my best friend since college. He had driven through the night after hearing about the accident from one of my coworkers. He hadn't slept in nearly 24 hours, yet he never left the hospital. Lucas told me my parents never came. Instead, he showed me social media photos from Kevin's wedding. My father was smiling during his speech. My mother was dancing with relatives. Every picture looked perfect. While they celebrated the happiest day of Kevin's life, I was lying unconscious in intensive care, connected to machines that kept monitoring every heartbeat. 2 days later, my parents finally arrived carrying flowers and balloons. My mother hugged me while crying, but the first thing my father said wasn't an apology. He asked whether I understood why they couldn't leave Kevin's wedding. He insisted they had faced an impossible choice and hoped I wouldn't spend the rest of my life blaming them for one difficult decision. I listened quietly before asking a single question. If Kevin had been the one lying in this hospital bed, would you have missed my wedding? Neither of them answered. My father looked toward the window while my mother lowered her eyes. That silence told me everything I had spent years refusing to admit. I wasn't imagining the difference in how they treated us. The moment they left the room, I made a decision that changed the rest of my life. I stopped chasing their approval. I focused entirely on my recovery, my career, and the people who had actually stood beside me when I needed them most. I didn't know it then, but 5 years later, my parents would desperately need something that only I could give them. Recovery wasn't easy. I spent nearly 8 months learning how to walk without pain again. Physical therapy became my second job. Some mornings I wanted to quit because every movement reminded me of the accident. Whenever that happened, Lucas showed up before work and completed every exercise beside me. He wasn't a therapist. He was simply the kind of friend my own family should have been. My parents called occasionally during those months, but every conversation eventually turned toward Kevin and his new married life. They talked about his honeymoon, his first house, and the promotion he had recently received. Rarely did they ask how my rehabilitation was going. I stopped expecting those questions because the answers never seemed important to them anyway. A year later, I returned to work with a slight limp that only appeared after long days on construction sites. My company promoted me to lead structural engineer after I completed a major bridge project ahead of schedule. For the first time, I felt proud of building a life that didn't depend on my parents' approval or recognition. Over the following years, I invested carefully, accepted larger projects, and eventually started my own engineering firm. The business grew faster than I expected because several former clients followed me immediately. Every achievement reminded me of the promise I made in that hospital room. I would never again waste energy trying to earn love from people unwilling to give it. Meanwhile, Kevin's life looked perfect from the outside. My parents constantly shared pictures of family vacations, expensive dinners, and anniversary celebrations. Friends often asked why I rarely appeared in those photos. I simply smiled and changed the subject. Explaining years of quiet favoritism to strangers always felt more exhausting than remaining silent. 5 years passed before my phone rang late one Saturday evening. My mother's voice sounded completely different from the cheerful woman I remembered. She wasn't calling to celebrate Kevin anymore. She was crying so hard I could barely understand what she was trying to say. All I caught were the words, "Please, it's your brother." I drove to the hospital without asking additional questions. When I arrived, I found my parents sitting outside the intensive care unit. My father looked 10 years older than the last time I had seen him. Kevin had suffered sudden kidney failure caused by an undiagnosed medical condition. Doctors said he needed a transplant as soon as possible. The moment my parents saw me, they both stood up. Before I could even ask how Kevin was doing, my father quietly said, "The doctors tested everyone in the family." Then he looked directly into my eyes. "Nathan, you're the only compatible donor we've found." Those words hit me harder than anything I expected to hear that night. For several seconds, nobody spoke. My mother reached for my hand while tears streamed down her face. She admitted doctors had already tested cousins, uncles, and even distant relatives. None of them matched closely enough. According to the transplant team, I was Kevin's only realistic chance of receiving a kidney before his condition became critical. As I stood there listening, memories of my own hospital room came rushing back. I remembered staring at my phone before surgery, waiting for parents who never came because they chose Kevin's wedding instead. Now those same parents were looking at me with desperate hope, praying I would save the son they had always chosen over me. Before answering, I asked to speak privately with Kevin. My parents looked surprised but agreed. A nurse led me into his room where machines quietly beeped around his bed. Kevin looked weak, nothing like the confident younger brother I remembered. When he opened his eyes and saw me standing there, he immediately looked away in shame. After a long silence, Kevin whispered the first honest words I had ever heard from him. He admitted he had always known our parents treated him differently. Instead of stopping them, he accepted every advantage because it made life easier. Looking back now, he realized he had mistaken their favoritism for love, and both of us had paid the price. He didn't ask me for a kidney. Instead, he quietly apologized for years of selfishness and said he would understand if I walked out of the room forever. "You already lost enough because of me," he whispered. "I don't want you risking your life just because Mom and Dad finally need something from you." His words stayed with me long after I left the room. For the first time in years, I believed Kevin wasn't pretending. He genuinely regretted everything that had happened between us. But regret didn't erase the past. The decision waiting for me wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about whether I was willing to risk my own health for someone who had never stood beside me. The transplant surgeon entered the consultation room carrying my medical results. After reviewing several pages, she looked at me seriously and said, "Nathan, before you make any decision, there's something important you deserve to know about donating your kidney." Dr. Sarah Mitchell closed the folder and spoke calmly. She explained that while I was an excellent match, donating a kidney would still be major surgery. Most donors recovered well, but there were real risks, and no doctor could guarantee a completely complication-free outcome. "This decision must be yours alone," she said. "Not your parents', not Kevin's, yours." She also made something else very clear. The transplant team would support whatever I decided. If I refused, nobody would pressure me or judge me. My medical records would remain confidential, and the hospital would simply inform my family that I wasn't a suitable donor. Hearing that lifted a weight I didn't realize I was carrying. After leaving the consultation room, I walked outside to clear my head. My phone buzzed. It was Lucas. Somehow he had already heard what was happening from one of my co-workers whose wife worked at the hospital. He didn't tell me what to do. He only reminded me of something I'd once told him during my own recovery. "You said your biggest dream was becoming the kind of man nobody else's mistakes could change," Lucas said quietly. "Don't make this decision out of anger, guilt, or pressure. Make it because you'll still be able to live with it 10 years from now." Then he hung up, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That night, I barely slept. Every memory returned at once. My parents missing my surgery, Kevin's wedding photos, months of painful rehabilitation, years of feeling like the second choice. But another memory also kept returning. Kevin's face when he apologized. For the first time in our lives, he hadn't blamed anyone except himself. The next morning, my parents were waiting outside the hospital cafeteria. They looked exhausted. My father stood up the moment he saw me and admitted there wasn't a single excuse left for the way they had treated me. "If I could go back to that wedding day," he whispered, "I'd make a different choice." I asked him why it had taken 5 years and Kevin's illness to finally admit that. He couldn't answer immediately. Eventually, he said something I never expected to hear. "Because losing Kevin made me realize I had already been losing you for years, and I refused to see it." My mother quietly nodded through tears. Even after hearing those words, I wasn't ready to make a decision. I asked for one final meeting with the transplant team. They reviewed every medical detail, explained the recovery process again, and answered every question honestly. They never once tried convincing me to donate. That honesty earned more of my trust than anyone else's promises. Before leaving the hospital that afternoon, I visited Kevin one last time. He looked even weaker than the day before, but when he saw me, he smiled faintly. "Whatever you decide," he said, "don't do it because of what Mom and Dad want. They already asked too much from you." I looked at my younger brother for several long seconds before finally speaking. "I'm not making this decision for Mom or Dad," I said quietly. "I'm making it because I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering whether I let my brother die when I had the chance to help." My words left Kevin completely speechless. 3 weeks later, both of us were wheeled into separate operating rooms. My parents hugged me before I disappeared through the double doors. This time, they didn't leave. They stayed in the waiting room for every hour of both surgeries, refusing to move until the doctors finally came out with news. The transplant was successful. Recovery was painful, but every day Kevin grew stronger. Mine was slower than expected because my body needed more time to adjust, yet I never regretted the decision. I hadn't changed the past, but I had chosen the kind of person I wanted to be in the future. During the following months, my parents visited almost every weekend. At first, I assumed guilt motivated them, but they kept coming long after I recovered. They didn't bring expensive gifts or empty promises. They simply showed up, helped around the house, cooked dinner, and slowly rebuilt the relationship they had neglected for years. Kevin also changed. He never expected everything to return to normal overnight. Instead, he earned trust the hard way. He apologized privately to friends and relatives for the way he had benefited from our parents' favoritism. Some people forgave him quickly, others didn't. He accepted every reaction without arguing because he knew he had deserved it. 1 year after the transplant, my parents invited both of us to dinner. Halfway through the evening, my father stood, raised his glass, and admitted something in front of the entire family that nobody expected to hear. "For years," he said, "I thought I knew which son was the strongest. I was wrong." The room fell completely silent. My father looked directly at every relative sitting around the table before continuing. "Nathan spent years trying to earn our approval, while we kept handing everything to Kevin without asking whether he deserved it. We didn't just fail one son. We failed both of them." Nobody interrupted because everyone knew he was telling the truth. Several relatives later admitted they had always wondered why my parents treated us so differently, but never wanted to interfere. Hearing that frustrated me more than I expected. Sometimes silence helps the wrong people continue making the same mistakes. Looking back, our family might have been very different if someone had spoken up years earlier. After dinner, my aunt quietly apologized for something I had completely forgotten. She reminded me that after my accident, she had attended Kevin's wedding instead of visiting the hospital because my parents assured everyone my injuries weren't serious. She had believed them without asking a single question. That lie hurt more people than I ever realized. As time passed, our family slowly became closer than it had ever been. The conversations changed. Instead of comparing Kevin and me, my parents finally started treating us as two different people with separate lives, dreams, and accomplishments. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time, nobody was competing for love that should have existed equally from the beginning. Nearly 2 years after the transplant, Kevin asked me to meet him at a small park where we used to play basketball as kids. He handed me an envelope and smiled nervously. "I've been carrying this around for months," he admitted. "I think it belongs to you more than it belongs to me." Inside the envelope was a copy of our parents' will. I immediately noticed something strange. Everything had been divided equally between us. When I looked up, Kevin quietly explained that he had asked our parents to rewrite it. "I spent too many years accepting things I never earned," he said. "I'm done living that way." I folded the document and handed it back to him. "The will isn't what matters," I replied. "What matters is that you finally became the brother I always hoped I'd have." Kevin laughed for the first time that afternoon. It wasn't the confident laugh I remembered from years ago. It sounded honest, and somehow that made all the difference. Months later, my parents organized another family gathering. This time, there wasn't a wedding, an anniversary, or a birthday. They invited everyone simply to celebrate being together. My mother quietly admitted she wanted to create new memories instead of spending the rest of her life regretting the old ones. None of us argued with that idea. As everyone talked around the dinner table, I caught my father watching Kevin and me laughing about an old childhood story. He smiled before saying something only I could hear. "For years, I thought loving one child more would make him stronger. All it did was make both of you carry pain neither of you deserved." Just before dessert, my father stood up once more and placed 2 small boxes on the table. He explained they had belonged to my grandfather and had been locked away for decades. "I was supposed to give one to each of you when you became men," he said quietly. "Instead, I let my own mistakes get in the way." Inside each box was Grandpa's old pocket watch along with a handwritten letter. Mine thanked me for always protecting the people I loved, even when they failed to protect me. Kevin's reminded him that real respect is earned through character, not through favoritism or easy rewards. Neither of us could speak after reading those words. Later that evening, Kevin admitted he had spent years believing our parents' attention meant he was somehow better than everyone else. It took losing nearly everything, including his health, to understand that unconditional praise can become just as damaging as constant rejection if it prevents someone from growing into a responsible adult. I realized something important that night. My parents' favoritism hadn't created one successful son and one forgotten son. It had created 2 unhappy sons in completely different ways. One constantly searched for approval, the other never learned how to live without it. Both paths led to pain until someone finally broke the cycle. Before everyone left, my mother hugged me and whispered something she had wanted to say since the day of my accident. "If I could relive one day of my life," she said through tears, "I'd be sitting beside your hospital bed instead of watching a wedding." I simply hugged her back because there was nothing else either of us needed to say. Looking back now, I don't remember the accident as the worst day of my life. Strange as it sounds, it became the beginning of everything that followed. It showed me who truly stood beside me, forced my family to confront painful truths, and eventually gave my brother and me the chance to build the relationship we should have had from the start. 5 years have passed since the transplant. I still visit the hospital once a year for routine checkups, and every appointment reminds me how close both Kevin and I came to living completely different lives. The doctors always smile when they see us together because they remember the brothers who once barely spoke, but now arrive joking with each other in the waiting room. Kevin eventually left the company where he had worked for years and started volunteering with an organization that supports patients waiting for organ transplants. He often tells them he isn't alive because he deserved a second chance. He's alive because someone chose compassion over resentment, even when resentment would have been completely understandable. One afternoon, I asked Kevin whether he ever regretted the way our childhood turned out. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Every single day," he admitted. "Not because Mom and Dad loved me more, but because I was too selfish to notice what it was doing to you while it happened." A few months later, my parents celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. During the party, my father surprised everyone by showing old family photographs. Instead of pretending everything had always been perfect, he openly talked about the mistakes he and my mother had made. It was the first time our family chose honesty over protecting appearances. When one picture from Kevin's wedding appeared on the screen, the room became completely silent. It was taken at almost the exact moment I was lying in an operating room waiting for emergency surgery. My father quietly turned off the projector and apologized once again. Even after all those years, that single photograph still carried enormous weight. After the anniversary, my mother confessed she had nearly deleted every wedding photo because looking at them filled her with guilt. I told her not to erase them. They weren't just reminders of a painful mistake. They were reminders of how easily people can lose sight of what truly matters when they're afraid of disappointing the wrong person. As life moved forward, my relationship with my parents became healthier than I ever thought possible. They stopped trying to erase the past and instead focused on doing better every single day. That change mattered far more than repeated apologies because real change is measured by actions, not by promises made through tears. Kevin and I eventually took another road trip together, something we hadn't done since we were teenagers. Somewhere along the highway, he laughed and admitted he couldn't remember the last time we argued. I smiled and told him that was probably because we had finally stopped competing for something that should never have been a competition. Sometimes people ask whether donating my kidney was the hardest decision I've ever made. It wasn't. The hardest decision happened years earlier in that hospital bed after my parents chose Kevin's wedding over my surgery. That was the day I decided to stop letting other people's choices define my own worth. Everything that followed grew from that single decision. Building my career, surrounding myself with people who truly cared, learning that family isn't determined only by blood. Ironically, walking away from my parents' approval became the very thing that eventually allowed our relationship to heal in a healthy and honest way. Looking back, I understand something I couldn't see as a child. Favoritism doesn't create winners. It creates distance, resentment, and years of unnecessary pain. One child grows believing love must be earned. The other grows believing love never has to be earned at all. Neither lesson prepares anyone for real life. If my parents had chosen differently on the day of Kevin's wedding, our family might never have faced the truth. Strange as it sounds, the worst day of my life eventually forced every one of us to become better people. Sometimes the deepest wounds reveal problems that everyone else spent years pretending didn't exist. Today, whenever someone tells me they're struggling because their family constantly compares them to a sibling, I share my story. Not because every family will change the way mine eventually did, but because nobody should measure their value by the unfair expectations placed on them by other people. My parents still apologize from time to time, and I always give them the same answer. Don't spend the rest of your lives apologizing for one terrible choice. Spend it making sure you never repeat it. They always nod because they understand that forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing to build something better from what's left. If this story taught me anything, it's that love is proven by the choices people make when life becomes difficult. Words are easy. Promises are easy. Showing up when someone truly needs you is what matters. And sometimes, The person everyone overlooked becomes the one who saves the entire family, not because they had to, but because they chose to.